The Messerschmitt, or Me-262, was an iconic jet fighter from World War II. Designed by the Germans, it was the first mass-produced and deployed jet fighter. In this video, we'll talk about the Me-262A-1A Schwalbe variant. Translated into English, Schwalbe means swallow. As production of the Me-262 was largely decentralized to avoid Allied bombs, small details or even instrument panel layouts can differ from plane to plane. That said, we've picked the details that we think are most representative of the aircraft. I'm David Webb, and this is Blue Paw Print. The Me-262 was a low-wing, twin-engined monoplane. The length was 34 feet 9 inches, or 10.6 meters. In cross-section, the main part of the Me-262's fuselage looks like a slightly inflated triangle with rounded corners. This shape was deemed to be the optimal for low cost, ease of assembly, maintenance, as well as having low drag. The fuselage was built out of both steel and aluminum alloys. Some lighter alloys were harder to source during the war, and so steel was often used for availability and cost reasons. This would come at the price of extra weight. Some non-stressed elements of the plane, such as the fuel tank cover and the control panel, were even built from plywood. The airframe consisted of longerons and stringers, connected by formers. The formers were made of U-shaped and J-shaped sheets of metal and were held in place by the longerons. Such a design could be made with the use of an unskilled and often unwilling labor force. The nose resembled that of piston-engine aircraft of the era. It had a small window at the tip for a camera lens, which we'll talk about later. There were main bulkheads between the ammunition storage and forward fuel tank. Another bulkhead sat between the forward fuel tank and the cockpit. One sat behind the cockpit and the rear fuel tank, and another was behind the rear fuel tank. There was an additional smaller bulkhead to separate the gun camera compartment. The bulkhead between the gun's ammunition and the forward fuel tank was understandably reinforced and fireproof. The rest of the bulkheads were aluminum, with stiffeners and open holes for cables, tubes, and linkages. The skin of the aircraft was 2 mm or 1/16 of an inch thick sheets of duralumin plating. These were overlaid and riveted to the frame. Only the section housing the gun barrels had steel sheets to withstand the gun blasts. After assembly, the fuselage surface was polished and painted. Any holes or slits were covered with filler or doped fabric and then painted, reducing the drag of the plane. The wings were of a double spar design and were made entirely of metal. The main spar was made of steel, with an auxiliary spar made out of duralumin. Spars were connected by main ribs and auxiliary ribs. The skin consisted of 2 to 2.1 mm or 2/25 of an inch thick duralumin sheets. Only on the lower part of the wings there were segments of 0.25 mm or 1/10 of an inch thick steel sheet. The wingspan was 41 feet 4 inches or 12.6 meters. The wings had an angle of sweep on the leading edge of -17 degrees. The transverse angle of a wing on a plane is the angle at which the wings are positioned relative to the horizontal axis of the aircraft. On the Me-262, this was -5 degrees, which meant the wings were slightly pointed up. Along the entire leading edge of the wing, except for the areas occupied by the engine nacelles, were located retractable, automatic, 3-section slotted wing slats. These slats were designed to improve the wing's performance at high angles of attack, such as during slow-speed flight or when maneuvering. On the trailing edge of the wing were flaps. When extended, the flaps increased the wing's surface area, generating more lift at lower speeds, thereby allowing the aircraft to take off and land at those lower airspeeds. To avoid pilot error, on the Me-262, the flaps could only be deployed when the undercarriage was lowered. The flaps were 2-sectional and separated by the engine nacelles. Ailerons that controlled roll were also separated in 2 parts to avoid issues as a result of aerodynamic deformation of the wing. The tail consisted of a vertical stabilizer, to which was attached a rudder to control the yaw of the airplane. There was a horizontal stabilizer, to which were attached 2 elevators to control the pitch of the plane. Their construction was all metal. The tail assembly, like the wings, had a swept-back design. The horizontal stabilizer had a sweep angle of 23 degrees, and the vertical stabilizer had a sweep angle of 45 degrees. The landing gear was a 3-point tricycle scheme with a front nose wheel and 2 main wheels under the wings featuring oil pneumatic shock suspension. Usually, the wheels were released and retracted by the hydraulic mechanism. The power was supplied by 2 Jumo 004 B1 jet engines, each with a thrust of 8.83 kilonewtons or 1,984 pound-force. The Jumo 004 was the first successful axial compressor turbojet engine and a predecessor of all modern turbine jet engines. Air was sucked into the open front section, then compressed by an 8-stage compressor and injected into one of 6 combustion chambers, where the air mixed with injected fuel and was ignited, producing a stream of hot gas. Some of the power produced rotated an axial compressor. The remaining gases flowed through the nozzle and created thrust. The speed of the exhaust gas could be controlled by a movable inner cone called a Zwiebel or onion bowl because of its shape. The engine was 12 feet 8 inches long, or around 3.86 meters. It was 2 feet 8 inches in diameter, or about 81 centimeters, and weighed 1,585 pounds, or 719 kilograms. To fire it up, it was started by a 2-cylinder, 2-stroke, gasoline-powered Riedel starter motor. The fuel used for the Jumo 004 was J2. This was a German World War II synthetic fuel produced from brown coal. The engine was designed to run on multiple fuels, including diesel. The 2 engines gave the Me-262 a maximum level flight speed of 540 miles per hour or 870 kilometers per hour. In a dive, though, it could potentially go much faster. However, the pilots were recommended to avoid a speed over 900 kilometers per hour or 560 miles per hour. The Germans were the first pilots to encounter issues with flight approaching the speed of sound. During tests, a prototype plane exceeded 970 kilometers per hour, but had severe vibrations and temporary loss of control. There is a legend about an Me-262 pilot who exceeded Mach speed and thus broke the sound barrier during World War II But the airspeed indicator reading would have been inaccurate at this speed, using a pitot tube for measurement. The rate of climb was an astounding 20 meters per second or 67 feet per second. The rate of dive in operation was not that impressive compared to the late war Allied fighters. German pilots even slowed before diving upon American bomber formations, so as not to exceed their safe speed during the attack. The fuel system consisted of 2 rubber self-sealing main tanks of 238 gallons each, or 900 litres, as well as auxiliary tanks, which gave an additional 204 gallons, or 770 litres. The main tanks could feed either the right or left engine, and this was controlled by the pilot using a switch on the left side panel of the cockpit. When the remaining fuel was reduced to 250 litres, or 66 gallons, a warning light was lit on the dashboard. The pilot had the job of balancing the fuel levels in the fuel tanks during flight to ensure stability. The maximum volume of fuel could, in theory, keep the Me-262 in the air for 60 to 90 minutes and give the plane a maximum range of 1,050 kilometers or 650 miles. The main armament consisted of 4 Mk-108 cannons with a 30mm or 1.2-inch caliber. Each cannon had a rate of fire of 650 rounds per minute, with a muzzle velocity of 520 meters per second, or 1,507 feet per second. The length of each gun was 3.3 feet, or 1 meter, and its barrel was 1.8 feet, or around half a meter. The electric triggers were located on the pilot's control stick. The cannon reloading mechanism was electro-pneumatic. Ammunition was stored in belts in protected boxes. A 0.72-pound shell with 0.19 pounds of explosive was capable of bringing down a heavy bomber such as the B-17 Flying Fortress or B-24 Liberator in just 4 hits. It needed just a single shattering hit to bring down an Allied fighter. Due to its distinctive pounding sound and high rate of fire, Allied aircrews called the Mk-108 the pneumatic hammer. There were large spherical supports around the barrels, which enabled adjustments to the gun's convergence. The guns usually were set to converge at around 450 to 500 meters, or around 500 to 550 yards. In front of the guns was a gun camera that activated whenever the pilot fired any of his guns, and stopped immediately upon releasing the trigger. Under the wings, there were mounted wooden racks with rockets. Several unguided missile models were tested and implemented on Schwalbe, the most advanced of which was the R-4M 4-kilogram rocket. These missiles could be fired from distances of up to 1,000 meters or 1,100 yards. Their trajectory in the middle range was roughly similar to the trajectory of the shots from the Mk-108, so the same gun sight could be used for the aiming of both weapons. Accuracy of these rockets was poor, so the Germans compensated this with numbers. Usually, an Me-262A-1 carried 24 of these missiles in total, a dozen under each wing. The rockets had electrical ignition and could be launched as a volley or one by one. Aside from the fuel tanks and the bulkheads around them, the cockpit was protected by a frontal 3.5-inch 90mm bulletproof glass and a 15mm 3/5-inch steel backplate behind the pilot's seat. On later planes, the backplate was extended to reach behind the pilot's head. The cockpit had a 3-section canopy. The cabin's layout was traditional, with only the engine indicator panel taking more space than usual. trim regulators, engine throttles, hydraulic, pneumatic and oxygen indicators and controls were to the left of the pilot. Switchboard, radio controls and Riedel engine starters to the turbines were controlled on the right-hand side of the pilot. And the instrument panel with the two clusters of indicators, flight indicators to the left and engine indicators to the right, was directly in front of the pilot. A rocket launch panel was added below the main instrument panel. The gun sight used most of the time in the Me-262's short career was the standard sight of the Luftwaffe, the Revi-16B. This was a reflector gun sight, which projected a ring and crosshair reticle onto glass directly in front of the pilot. It was less effective than the later gyroscope-tuned EZ-42 model, but was effective enough for short ranges and against large targets. To enter the cabin, a pilot would climb on the left wing and lift the middle section of the canopy and climb in. The seat had no padding, and so the pilot sat on his parachute. After entering, the pilot would buckle up. The pilot would activate a number of switches in order: the battery switch, then the inverter, then the generators. He would ensure that the fuel selector valve was off and the throttles were at minimum. He would push down the starter handle to prime the Riedel starting motor. He would then pull the starter handle and hold, and at the same time he would press the tachometer button and hold it in. The engines would then rotate. When each engine reached 700 to 800 revolutions per minute, the pilot would press the ignition button on the right side of the throttle and hold. A deep throbbing noise would be heard as the unit began firing. Then the engine speed would be increased to around 1,800 to 2,000 RPM. The pilot could then release the starter handle and tachometer button and open a fuel selector valve. At this time, the rear fuel tank is supplying both engines. The pilot would slowly advance the throttle to 3,000 RPM. At 3,000 RPM, the pilot released the throttle ignition button as the engine is now self-igniting. On the ground, the pilot steered by using the main wheel brakes. By now, the jets are running at 4,000 to 6,000 RPM. With the plane in position, the pilot would hold the aircraft with the main wheel brakes and open the throttles very slowly for the engine to reach around 7,000 RPM. He would then switch the left engine to the front main fuel tank and the right engine to the rear main fuel tank. Releasing the brakes and opening the throttles fully would start the plane down the runway. All the while, he would make directional corrections with brakes only. The control stick would be in a neutral position. After the takeoff speed of around 125 miles per hour was reached, the pilot would pull gently back on the stick. This would move the elevators at the rear into a raised position, and the plane would gently become airborne. To stop the wheels rotating, the pilot would apply the brakes before retracting the landing gear. Initially, the Me-262 would climb higher than the expected target formation altitude. Once in position, the pilot would switch on the power for the guns and rockets and flip the metal safety cover forward on top of the control stick. Then, when the enemy was in sight, the pilot would quickly fly to the side and above the enemy. When ready, he would slightly bleed the speed, turning into the formation and dive. He would aim to cut across the box formation of the bombers. Looking through the Revi-16 gun sight, the pilot would see the glowing crosshair with the range marks and the ring. The pilot calculated range and deflection based upon experience. If taking on a B-17, the pilot would look as to where the wingtips of the B-17 would appear on the sight. If the wings filled 2 full marks, that would mean the distance was around 1,100 yards or 1 kilometer. When the plane was at a distance of 1,100 to 600 yards or 1 kilometer to 550 meters, the pilot would press the switch to launch a volley of rockets. And then, when the B-17's wingtips filled almost the entire circle, the distance would be around 330 yards or 300 meters. The pilot would press the buttons to fire short bursts from his 30mm guns to shoot at any available target as he passed. After diving, the Me-262 would try to climb back higher than the bombers to make another pass. But if too many escort fighters were gunning on him, the pilot may simply accelerate and outrun the pursuers until they lost sight of the German jet. When low on fuel or ammunition, the pilot would head for home. Inability to maneuver and relatively slow speed at takeoff and landing was used by Allied pilots to catch the Me-262s when they were at their most vulnerable. By diving at slow and unmaneuverable targets from above, this tactic got the nickname rat catching. It's estimated that around 1,470 Me-262s were built in total. Due to delivery and logistics issues and a lack of trained pilots, only around 300 Me-262s took part in action. Eventually, the Me-262 proved to be a formidable interceptor. But at this time, the German industry was too damaged and the US industry produced too many planes that the Me-262 could not really make a difference. The Me-262's conceptual scheme was copied in many designs, such as the Soviet Su-9 and the Japanese Nakajima Kika. Some design ideas from the Me-262 were used in several prominent planes, including the MiG-15 and the F-86 and B-47s. The turbojet engine, housed in an underwing nacelle, proved to be such a successful design that it still features today in almost all modern airliners. In researching this film, we were privileged to record some video of an actual Me-262. You can find that video and help the channel by supporting us on Patreon. If you spotted any errors, please let us know in the comments. We're looking to continuously improve. Thank you.